All right. Welcome back to the Protocol Town Hall, a periodic guest talk series focused on protocols and protocol research. Today, we are speaking with Varun Srinivasan, uh, about some architecture and technology. Varun is from Farcaster, the CTO and a co-founder, I believe. There will be a link in the YouTube chat to the Summer of Protocols forum and website where we host any of the conversation during the salon. Yeah, our next town hall will be our final researcher salon with the 2023 Summer of Protocols cohort with Sarah Friend on her research essay titled A Good Death. You can find that at summerprotocols.com along with the program calendar and more information about the protocol kit. Now I'll go ahead and hand it off to Venkat to introduce Varun for us.
All right. Really excited about this session because this program is sponsored by the Ethereum Foundation. But as those of you who've been following along know, we try to keep it broad. So we've often talked a lot about lots of other protocols, and we've had several sessions about blockchain specific topics, but I believe this is the first time we are actually talking to somebody who's built like an honest to goodness blockchain product. Like for most people, it's like you sign up for a wallet, maybe you do a few transactions, but you've never actually used a serious product beyond maybe buying an NFT. So looking forward to getting into it. So the way we're going to structure today's talk is Varun and I will have a Q&A type conversation for about 30-40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. And before we get into it, I'll also flag that a few weeks ago we had a similar Q&A session with the founders of Blue Sky. So for those of you who are interested in sort of like the emerging protocol landscape, you might want to watch that after this one as well. It'll be kind of interesting to pair those two conversations. All right, so Varun and I, we met briefly while I was living in LA. So we went on a long walk together in the Venice neighborhood and chatted, and we discovered we had one thing in common, which is my family comes from Coimbatore and Varun is from Coimbatore as well. So we have a city connection in India. Varun is a Coinbase veteran who went on to found Farcaster with Dan Romero. And when you say founder in blockchain context, it's more complicated than a regular startup. So I believe the company is called Merkle Manufactory. The protocol, which is kind of like half owned by the public commons, is Farcaster. And the specific commercially funded product you guys are building is Warpcast, right? So that's kind of more the traditional startup-y thing that's venture funded. Farcaster ideally will end up as like a commons asset owned by everybody who participates in the protocol. And Merkle is the company building Warpcast and presumably other products in the future. Did I explain that correctly, Varun?
Yeah, no, that's roughly right. So first of all, thanks for having me. It's been really cool to follow, first your work on Ribbon Farm and then Summer of Protocols. I actually got my protocol kit in the mail just last week, so it's been cool to play around with that. But jumping right into like what we're working on, I think that the simplest way to describe it is we're building two things. And this is a little different from your traditional Silicon Valley company where you're building a single thing. We're building Farcaster, which is the protocol that actually helps different participants in the network connect and interact with each other, just like email is the protocol that you use to send messages. And then we're also building Warpcast, which is the first client that you can use to access this protocol. There are actually multiple clients now, but Warpcast is one of the ones that we built. It's the one that launched on day one. And you can sort of think of it as like the Gmail to your email, but there will be other clients like Outlook, Proton Mail, et cetera, that solve different problems in this ecosystem.
Yeah, and for those who are not familiar with Farcaster and Warpcast, the basic experience, the basic default experience is kind of like Twitter, but there's a lot of like unusual blockchain features. So if you're not on Farcaster yet, I recommend you do get on, but you do have to like jump through some few hoops to get there. And there's like cheaper and more expensive ways of creating an account. And it is for various structural reasons, you do have to pay to have an account. Though those of us who were lucky enough to get in early, we kind of got in free and got on chain in a different pathway. But yeah, we'll post links on how to get on Warpcast in the forum after this session. But let's get into the conversation. So this is an unusual and rare kind of like role to be in, the architect of not just a protocol, but a leading edge blockchain based crypto protocol. So can you walk us through your career trajectory going from, like, I'm guessing traditional technology, then Coinbase, and then into doing this kind of work?
Sure. So I guess starting from the very beginning, I kind of started tinkering around with computers when I got my first computer, roughly fourth grade or so. I never really got into traditional programming, but became technical by tinkering around with things on the computer, wanting to play video games, wanting to use the latest Microsoft Office. As you can imagine, Coimbatore in the 1990s did not have a thriving software scene where you could just go and get what you wanted. So you had to get creative and learn how to like find software on the internet and get into like a lot of stuff. And so that's kind of where I first cut my teeth on how like computers and the internals and networking worked and all of this stuff. Later on, went off to college, and that's where I got started with programming. And particularly, I learned PHP and started building apps on Facebook. The first app we built was this thing called Moocher, which sucked up all the free food events from all across campus and built you a calendar for food that you could, as long as you were willing to eat pizza for a week, you could just eat for free all across campus. And it was kind of my first foray with social, where I wasn't really an engineer by training even at that point, but it was really cool to see how you could build this very simple thing and leverage the primitives of the social graph to make something that's like very valuable for everybody. It's kind of this like really cool feeling, like when you build like a Lego set and you finally put those pieces together and this thing works, but in a way that it's actually useful to other people. But then, Facebook started turning APIs off and Twitter and this. And so building on social didn't seem to be something that was really possible for folks outside. So over time, kind of trying to figuring out what I wanted to do, I went to work at Microsoft. I actually went in a sort of program manager oriented career at Microsoft and worked on OneNote, which was a tool that I had actually used a lot earlier on to take notes. And, kind of the typical thing of like, you want to work on the thing that you like using. It was really fun to go work on OneNote. And I tended to gravitate towards like some of the harder and harder problems there. So one of the things I got really excited about was like the very low level fundamentals of how sync worked. And the interesting tie-in from working on a note-taking application to Farcaster is it turns out that a lot of the problems you have in a decentralized social network is there are many servers, and how do you get them to sync with each other? And so a lot of the fundamental research that we were doing back in the day actually many years later came back to play, which we can kind of get into later. But post Microsoft, I sort of zigged a little bit and went to start a company that was focused on helping people with hearing loss use their smartphones. I'd spent a lot of time in music. I'd met a co-founder who actually grew up with hearing loss, and this was sort of this unsexy market that nobody was really looking at that was $6 billion. And it was something that was like technically really, really fun. Digital signal processing is this like really cool problem space, but also something where we thought we had an edge. For a variety of reasons, most of which were around, there were just a lot of gatekeepers in the ecosystem. That product never really worked and that company didn't take off. We like tried a bunch of variants, including building hardware, but ultimately decided to shut it down and kind of step back and thought about what I wanted to do next. This was like circa 2013 or 2015. And the two most interesting spaces at the time to me were AI and crypto. Like I just found those like very intellectually interesting back then, and kind of like tinkered around with it, but never really got the time to get deep. And funnily enough, I got to scratch both itches because I joined Coinbase and got to work on their fraud side, which was using AI to combat a lot, or like early ML, to combat a lot of the like fraud and scams that were happening in this space. That's how I started at Coinbase. I spent a bunch of time getting deeper into the protocol side of things, helped launch Ethereum at Coinbase. That was one of the things I did in 2016, and then really focused on helping scale Coinbase through 2017 to 2019 when we were dealing with a lot of growth and volume, just dealing with challenges all across the board. And I left Coinbase in 2019 and started thinking about, what do I want to work on next? And I knew I wanted to work in decentralizing things because that seemed to be a big unlock. Like I think Bitcoin and Ethereum had kind of brought new patterns for how to decentralize systems that were previously thought to be very hard computer science problems. And we were thinking about, okay, how can we take this and apply it to different places? So reconnected with Dan Romero, my co-founder now at Farcaster, who I worked with at Coinbase. And we spent about 6 months just grinding through the idea space, kicking around different ideas from DeFi to hardware to other things, and eventually landed on social as the thing that felt like we both had good founder market fit, where we were both excited about building something in the space, but also something that, back in 2020, not a lot of people were thinking about doing very actively. And there weren't a lot of new blockchain-based approaches. And so we decided to focus on this, which is how Farcaster started.
That's a wild trajectory, going from like PHP food events through notebooks. Then, couple of points you said there struck out at me. Like you mentioned notebooks. I was not aware you had worked on notebooks, but that's been an interesting story in its own right? Like you had the old Evernote, OneNote era of notebooks. Then you had Rome Research and Notion style graph database, kind of like notebooky things. And now Gordon Brander, who did a guest talk several months ago, he's building the Noosphere protocol, which is kind of like notebooking for the world hive mind in a decentralized distributed way. So it's like any application you can think of, no matter how boring, you can kind of like fast forward from the 1990s era tech to like a blockchainy flavor, right? But let's talk about some of the evolutions in technical thinking that you've clearly gone through over the last 15, 20, or what is it, 25 years, I guess now for you. And one of the ideas you wrote about was sufficient decentralization. That was an essay you wrote, I think, a couple of years back. We read it in the reading group that I'm part of. And that's kind of an interesting idea, because decentralization, most people have a black and white political sort of like cartoon view of what decentralization means. So even adding sufficient as an adjective to it is sort of like too subtle for more people. And sufficient decentralization, as I understand it, has both a technical aspect and there's almost like a regulatory aspect where it's a test for whether something is a commodity, for example, right? So yeah, can you talk about sufficient decentralization and how you think about it?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think when people say decentralization, particularly when it comes to social media or generally software, it usually at the surface level means one thing. There are many servers. So there's no one person in control. There's no single box that you can turn off that shuts down the entire network. But as soon as you scratch that surface and you start thinking about how do I want to build this, there are actually multiple models for decentralization with very, very different trade-offs. And so if you think about like what are the sort of extremes of decentralization, the earliest forms are client P2P decentralization. This is like the BitTorrent model, where you have a piece of software that runs on your computer that you use that peer-to-peers with everyone else that's online and kind of communicates. And very early decentralized social networks like Secure Scuttlebutt kind of took this approach to decentralization. You also have what you think of as more traditionally the federated model of decentralization. And email, the internet, and protocols like ActivityPub are also built on federation. And the idea behind federation is, well, clients have to go offline from time to time, so that's not ideal that no one can see your stuff when you're off. So let's actually make servers, but let's make it so that anyone can run their server and you can pick the server that you want to join. And there's some loose protocol to make it so that you can collaborate between servers. This tends to work really well for things that are point-to-point like email, where just two servers talk and the communication happens. It gets a little trickier in social media, where sometimes you need to do operations that depend on the state of all the servers. Like I want to look up if VGR is a username, I need to now talk to every other server. So that starts to get a little more complex. The third flavor, and this is sparked by Ethereum and Bitcoin, was the notion that like, hey, you can actually, rather than splitting state across these servers and trying to coordinate, why not put everything on a single blockchain where there's one box that holds everything, and you reduce the amount of data on that box by charging money for putting stuff on that box, but you get everything kind of holed up in this one place, and that's a really nice property. So those are kind of the three extremes of decentralization. The thing that we were trying to get at with sufficient decentralization is not to actually be overly prescriptive about which path to take. But if you've built a solution using one of these paths or a hybrid path, how do you know that you are decentralized enough? Like what is the minimum bar that you need to meet? And so the way we define that bar is to say, if two users on the network want to communicate with each other, even if every single other actor on the network wants to stop them, they must still be able to do this. And if that's possible, you have a sufficiently decentralized social network. And it's sort of a fuzzy test, because in a theoretical way, that's like very possible by hosting stuff on web servers and using like an old model. But the bar that we try to hold ourselves to is it practical? Like, can most users actually reach another person if the rest of the network wants to stop them? And how do we continue to evolve this network to a place that actually gets there? So that's the litmus test. And in that article, we actually took a prescriptive approach and said, hey, the way we think Farcaster V1 is going to work is there's going to be this thin blockchain layer. It's like a global identity registry. So everyone's usernames and like ID numbers are stored on the blockchain. And then we'll do federation. So we said, hey, Farcaster V1, everyone has these servers. You can store data on your own servers. And the reason I can always communicate with you is I can find your address on the blockchain and then come straight to your server and fetch your data. And therefore, even if every other server on the internet wants to stop me from doing it, as long as you and I have a server that we control, we can always talk to each other. We've actually changed our POV on that. And then this may be a subject of another question, but we've actually moved away from the federated model into something different because we ran into a lot of challenges with that. But that's sufficient. That's the point of the sufficient decentralization article, to set this test and then to have like an opinionated view on how we were approaching it at that point in time.
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting that architecting these things, you come up with these heuristic principles and then you try them and it doesn't work, and then you have to modify both your approach but also update your philosophy as well, right? One principle that I saw from, I think, the zero tier guys, the VPN folks, was something like decentralized till it hurts and then centralized till it works. So that seems like a very traumatic way of putting it, but something similar seems to be true of like all principles. Like, take the principle in its abstract, idealized form, push it to the extreme, see what breaks and whether it works at all outside of utopia, then pull back in some way and see if it works. If not, you have to pull back in a different way. But yeah, for those who are not like heads down in the weeds doing like deep architecture stuff on a particular protocol, what are some of your top rules of thumb like this? So sufficient decentralization, it's kind of a litmus test. You could apply it to many other protocols besides, blockchain messaging type things. What are some other like protocol fortune cookie trade-off aphorisms that you operate by?
It's a good question. I think one of the things that's challenging with protocols is they tend to vary across domains. So like, jumping into like what Farcaster is specifically, right? Like, Farcaster is if you were to boil it down to like what happens when you open the app today, it's a largely Twitter-like client. You post text messages, you can see messages from other users, there's some images and videos, but largely it's people reading a feed of text-based content. I think the things that we have adopted as we have built Farcaster tend to come from this domain of like, what do we need to build here to be successful? And the first thing that we needed to think about is, what on the spectrum of network effects, how important is network effects to your protocol? Because some protocols and some systems are very useful on day one, even if you don't have a lot of users and a lot of people acting in it. And the way you would build that protocol is very different. You can kind of start with like this idealized state of like what needs to happen, make it work for one-to-one cases, and then slowly scale out to one-to-n. But if you have a protocol that's extremely dependent on network effects, it's very hard to get that one-to-one started because it's not as useful. So to give you an example, like, if you're building like an operating system or an open source piece of software, it is useful on day one to one person who's applying that to fix something in their ecosystem. It does get better over time as more developers are using it, but it has value on day one. If I build a decentralized social network and you join and you and I are the only users, it does not have a lot of value on day one. You actually need to get to hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands before it's actually valuable. And so what we drew from this is like, since we're on this end of the spectrum, we started to believe that what we needed to do was really product-led protocol development. We had to go figure out like what users actually wanted from this social network, which I think is a very important question, and then figure out how to turn it into a protocol. And so we took this approach, which I don't necessarily think everyone should, but some people definitely should, which is, we don't know what users want yet. We have this like idealized vision of like one of the properties of our system, which is decentralization, but we don't actually understand the rest of them, which is what makes this useful to you on a day-to-day basis. And we need to go figure that out and turn it into a protocol thing. So the two kind of sound bites I'd extract from that are, one, thinking about where you fall on the scale of network effects is very important, since it changes your tactics. And if you find yourself on the heavy end of the network effect scale, it might be worth really thinking about how do you make the protocol useful to people before you worry too much about decentralizing it.
On the second one, I think you described the idea of like figuring out what's useful to people. Your co-founder Dan often tweets about revealed preferences over stated preferences, right? And I think that's particularly critical in the context of network effects, because what you're describing is like the two-sided marketplace question from Web 2.0, but on steroids. Like back then, people used to talk about the chicken and egg problem of getting the buying and selling side of a marketplace product sort of like booted up at the same time. So it's like, I guess, 4 times as hard as just like a one-sided market where you're just selling a service. And I guess with protocols, it's like a 3-sided marketplace. So you've got I don't know, the producers and consumers of like tweet-like content, but then you also got developers, you've got people running hubs. So I don't know, this is like a 4 or 5-sided network effect that you're trying to boot up at once. Also, I think your point about network effects, Dan tweeted something yesterday. He said, the one thing I've learned from Varun is the order in which you solve problems is very important, right? Is this related at all? The fact that network effects drive things so strongly means you have to do things in a certain sequence, or did you mean something else by that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we learned the hard way through building like early versions of Farcaster is, I think early on, I would say for the first 2 years, we leaned very heavily into decentralization. We were like, we know what the users want. They want Twitter. Let's like go figure out a way to decentralize this thing. And if I were to go back, if Dan and I were to go back and replay that, I think we would have been much more aggressive on what actually sets us apart from Twitter and why are people using this as a complement or as something different, and cracked that first before decentralizing it. Because the history, well, actually, this is kind of an interesting segue, but the history of Farcaster was V0 was this crazy gigabrain client P2P model that I built where I was like, oh, you'll just run this app on your desktop and it'll peer with everyone and it'll be amazing. About 1 week in, I was like, this is a terrible idea. There's just a variety of user experience things that become really, really hard that most people will not want to tolerate. And so V1 became federated. And we said, hey, like based on that sufficient decentralization idea, let's actually have this federated model. And we built it out and we lived on that model for almost a year. And again, we sort of like ignored the like, what product do people want? And we really focused on this. And I think the challenges that we ran into early on were it took a really, really long time to get the protocol done right before we started asking ourselves the question of why do people want to be on this network? And what we quickly realized and the challenges with V1 were when you have this federated network, it becomes really hard for developers. So the problem is very simple. There are 10, 20, 30 servers that all store information about the state of the network. You need to go and generate a list of the latest messages to make a useful app. So I need to know that, VGR said this 5 seconds ago, Varun said this 10 seconds ago. How do you do that in a real-time fashion? Like even Google, a company that does this, has like delays when they go and crawl and index the web. And it turns out to be a really, really hard problem as this gets more and more decentralized. And so we spend a lot of time worrying about like, how do we decentralize this? How do we scale this and so on? And I think in hindsight, we would have spent much more time focused on the like, what is setting us apart, which over time we have learned that the things people care about in a social network are status, entertainment, or belonging. And you have to find some way to offer one of those to people on day one. And if you do that and you are decentralized, decentralization becomes this really powerful moat over time that actually helps protect and make it so that developers can build on this. But if all you're doing is building the moat on day one and there's no castle to defend, that's not a very valuable thing to have in the first place.
I think you guys lucked out in a certain way because you're building on blockchain. That itself became a little bit of a differentiator in who chose to come to Farcaster. Because when I compare your experience to the trajectory of Blue Sky, for example, Jack had like very idealistic visions of like he originally wanted Twitter to be truly a protocol, and then it became a company, and therefore Blue Sky he was hoping it would be a protocol, and then more recently he left the board, kind of complaining that Blue Sky, you are repeating all the mistakes that Twitter did, and then the Blue Sky lead dev, your counterpart there, Jack, he had a long thread about like why Jack is basically wrong. So I think one of the interesting implications of this is when you ask what do people want of this decentralized social service, in the specific case of Twitter-like services, I think the elephant in the room is the main thing people want is for it to not be Twitter. And I think that's what has been the problem that Blue Sky has been grappling with, because their big audience was people who were trying to get away from Twitter for political reasons. Same thing with ActivityPub. We have an ActivityPub focused project in this cohort of summer protocols. I think 2017 to 2020 or whatever, ActivityPub had its own unique internal culture. But then the big spike of adoption was literally, I hate Elon Musk, therefore I'm going to ActivityPub. And that's kind of not an attraction. So you guys had an advantage there in that you had a reason different from simply disliking Elon Musk as the reason people were joining. They were genuinely curious about what blockchains can do, right? So let's talk about that a little bit. I have a bunch of questions around that, but maybe the right place to start is you guys, I think, have experienced one of the first true both blockchain things beyond NFTs, like a true product-like features, and what I would call protocol market fit, which is like, I think, really interesting to watch. So this, I'm referring to your frames feature recently. So for those who haven't used Farcaster, one thing it can do that Twitter and ActivityPub and Blue Sky can't do is they've got this mechanism called frames, which are kind of like tweets, but it's sort of like frames, a little piece of application logic that talks to a server you're running somewhere else. So I could run like a Python server somewhere that does some logic, like poll options that are then displayed as a graph. So like I could run a little mini app for polls, and that would become embedded in a tweet-like thing in the main feed itself. And you can kind of like effectively turn the Farcaster feed into this huge global stream of, I don't even know what to call them. You guys call them frames, but in terms of what it actually is, it's like little tidbits of application logic flowing in a big public stream, right? And this is a truly protocol-like feature that really wouldn't be possible in like a traditional platform thing. So yeah, walk us through the experience of like thinking about frames, getting it out there, how you got developers in the loop, how it became this sort of like viral protocol market fit event.
Yeah, so this actually kind of stems from what you alluded to earlier, which is we early on made the decision to lean into crypto as like, hey, this is the group of people that we want to bring together on day one. And what we noticed, this is about a year ago, is people in the feed were starting to share NFTs. They were like things they wanted to mint, things they had done. And they were showing up on the feed. If you're familiar with the Open Graph protocol, it's like Facebook's standard for how a link should be shown up in a social feed. So rather than this like, sort of ugly and uninteresting hypertext link, you actually have a nice image and a heading and a description, and it kind of looks nice. NFTs were showing up in that way, but it kind of didn't make sense because the images were the wrong size, the descriptions weren't useful. And so we said, okay, maybe we can actually make this better. And so we took the Open Graph protocol and we just said, hey, let's extend this in a simple way. Let's add a property where you can specify a different image and say this is an NFT image, and these things will now look nicer in the feed. And so we did this with Zora, one of the early NFT companies that we'd known from the Coinbase era, and it instantly made the feed better, and it drove a lot more clicks to their site. And then we said, hey, the reason people want these NFTs is they're trying to mint them. They're trying to do this action on chain. What if we just make that easier and actually have a mint button so when you see this is actually a little piece of interactive content. So we shipped this thing, and that took basically a very, very simple, very old internet protocol, added a couple lines to it, and turned this very static, uninteresting object into this slightly more dynamic object. And the really, really cool thing was Zora integrated it, and within like 48 hours, every NFT platform had shipped the same thing. Partly because it was so easy to do. It was any engineer with like 30 minutes who understood the basics of HTML could ship it, and partly because it gave them distribution. Now, when your stuff shows up in Farcaster, people are more likely to click on it, which means people are more likely to come to your site. And that was sort of the genesis. I call that the like proto frame, which Dan and the team worked on like early in the day. And then much later, as we were thinking about like, okay, what can we take from this and extend it, we started kicking around the idea of like, could we make these a little more interactive? So rather than a single step where you just get to take an action, could we do multiple steps where you first see an image and some buttons and you can interact with them, and then you send a response to the server and it sends you back another image and buttons. And this like very simple shift, again, using the same Open Graph standard and the same primitives, immediately let developers build a lot more complex stuff. And the way we shipped frames was we kind of thought about it on Tuesday. We had a basic version of it by Wednesday, and we went to a bunch of the early developers in Farcaster, and we said, hey, would you build something on this? And about 3 of them immediately said, yeah, we'll do it, and we'll ship it by this Friday. And that was the spark of like, oh, maybe there's something here. And what was really cool was we launched it at 9 a.m. and like by noon, 2 other people who had never even seen the spec before or knew how it worked had already started shipping apps on it. And in hindsight, the reason this was all valuable was we had spent the last 3 years building up this social graph that was incredibly valuable, and then we added interactivity to that graph. So if you built an app, you could qualify who was clicking on it by looking at, did they follow you, did they have a lot of followers, were they interesting, and then could give them a different experience based on what they wanted. And so that really opened the floodgates for people to build lots and lots of different kinds of applications. Somebody launched a frame where you could buy Girl Scout cookies on chain and sold like $10,000 of cookies for his daughter's troop like overnight, which is like a really cool moment. Now you have frames where you can send out bounties for things and do other kinds of actions. And I think frames really work because until that point, if you wanted to build on Farcaster, the only way to do something interesting was to go build a client, which was years of work to build something interesting. But now you could, with a few hours of work, take your app and your service and put it in front of users and have it really grow and grow viral. And that was like a really aha moment for both developers and for us in terms of like, this is kind of the most interesting thing about on-chain social, is making it easier for users and developers to connect on interesting things.
I'm reminded the way you're describing it, there's been a similar evolution in things like WordPress, for example. So there was the base product, which takes like a very deep team, a long time to build. Then there's like themes, which are still fairly complex skinning artifacts. Then you had like theme frameworks, Thesis, and I forget, Genesis is the one I use. And for theme frameworks, you have a much lighter weight thing called, I guess, a skin. I don't know what to call it, but these things get progressively easier. And then you have plugins, of course. I think what's unique about frames is not only does it walk this well-known path of like the marginal contribution being lower and lower, it sort of like abstracts away a lot of the social UX part so that you don't have to think about it. Like I'm trying to think like, in Web 2, yeah, you might use Facebook for authentication, but that was the limit to which you would actually take advantage of Facebook's like existing social community. Here you're going a lot deeper, and I'm still not very comfortable with the experience of seeing effectively an emergent meta application in the Warpcast client, which is like a list of bookmarked frames that look like tweets but are actually little fragments of application logic. Actually, more than NFTs, I think my aha moment with frames was somebody came up with this game called Yoink, which is kind of like a capture the flag frame game where you just grab like a flag, and then there's a leaderboard of like who's grabbed the frame or the flag the most times. And I saw that and I was like, this is taking something like the Dark Forest on-chain game, which is this very heavy-duty space battles kind of game, and reduce the game mechanic down to like the absolute simplest possible game mechanic, which is grab the flag, and it's presented in the context of like a Twitter-like feed. And this is like the shift is like even bigger than traditional desktop gaming in the 90s to something like Facebook's Zynga games like Farmville. It's like doing something very interesting there. But to switch gears from that a little bit, you mentioned that you collaborated with Zora and making this like a seamless NFT workflow, and presumably that kind of relationship will develop. So one of the things with building something like Farcaster is you've got a lot of like relationships, both with like users and other developers. And I guess the Purple DAO is kind of like a community that is involved in governance. And you've got entities like Zora that you're collaborating with at a more B2B level. And then, of course, you have your own trade-off and tension of like having a for-profit private company, Merkle doing a client, which has like huge default incumbent bias as like the most likely client people are going to use when they first sign up is going to be Warpcast. So how do you manage the tension of like curating the company versus curating the community versus giving things away to your business partners like Zora? And how does that work? Not at like the abstract level, but at this level of like specific features. Like, you've got channels, you've got direct costs, you've got NFT support. You guys have your own in-app, not currency per se, but the Warp's currencies, whatever works within Apple iStore, Apple Store rules. So you're making like these feature by feature decisions of like, does this belong in Warpcast? Does this belong in Farcaster? Does it belong with a partnership like Zora? And if it belongs in one of these other places, you've got a governance process that you have to interface to. Yeah. So can you walk us through how you make those decisions, maybe with a couple of specific examples, like, direct costs and channels, for example?
Yeah. So I'll talk about this in two dimensions. I think first one is like Warpcast to Farcaster, like what is that relationship? How has it changed and how will it change over time? And I think the second piece, which is also interesting, is how does Farcaster's governance work? How does like the protocol itself make decisions? So the thing that we would absolutely love is if we could just sit back and build the protocol and write Rust code and think about distributed systems, and other people would come and do all the hard work about building clients. And but it turns out that at least for a social protocol, the hardest part on day one tends to be getting users, and the easier part tends to be building the protocol. And I think that inverts over time. Like as you get bigger and bigger, the protocol problems get really, really hard. But that was like one of the things we were wrong about when we first started building Farcaster. We thought that there would be a lot of clients on day one. And if we step back and look at Warpcast, we have probably spent 20 person years of time actually just building this thing out to make it useful to people. And there's still a lot of work to be done. Now, we zigged and zagged. Maybe if you had a perfect mental model, you could build this in 2 years, not repeat any of the mistakes. But that's still a huge investment of time for anyone who wants to come and say, let me get started on this ecosystem. I mean, we built it because, we had this vision of like what we wanted to do for Farcaster, but it's unrealistic to expect the average user to come and do that without some payoff or some user base. And so what we've noticed is that like as we've gotten users and as we've grown the protocol, that has materially changed. We went from a one client world to now multiple clients where there's Supercast, Nook, HeroCast, OpenCast, and a bunch of alternative clients emerging and growing day by day. And the main reason is because we've managed to get more users. And so every time we go back to developers, we go back to partners, we go to the ecosystem and we ask, like, what do you really, really want? And get from that, stated preference to the revealed preference, the answer is we want users. Because the more users you have on your protocol, the more valuable the things we build are, and the more likely that we can be to succeed. And so our mental model for Warpcast is anything we can do to increase the pie for everybody makes it more likely that other developers are going to come and build on us. And that's the number one thing we need to be doing. And there is maybe a far future day where when Farcaster, the protocol, has 10 or 100 million users, where we can kind of step back and say, okay, we will like help govern and shepherd the protocol and other people will drive clients. But I think until we get to that point, it's our battle to lose. And if we take the gas off of Warpcast, this thing kind of doesn't really scale and doesn't get to that exit path. In terms of how do we think about features going from Warpcast to Farcaster, so we've the way to think about it is we do this product-led protocol approach where we prototype something in the simplest way possible in the product while having this mental model for how it might get decentralized. And we test it out. And the main thing we're testing for is this actually useful to people? And does this particular incarnation of the feature work for people? And we're often wrong about that in social networks. So things that we have successfully started in Warpcast and moved to the protocol are follows, usernames, crypto address verifications. All of this stuff was initially not on Farcaster and then slowly made its way into the protocol. Stuff that didn't make it, location, was a good example of a feature we shipped. We thought it would be really cool. People would update their location. Turns out things that you don't do on a daily basis are not that interesting. And so we never moved it to the protocol because it just didn't seem like a pain point. And there's things that we are currently working on, like channels and direct messages. But our mental model is If there is a feature that actually has network effects and other clients will gain benefit by this being accessible, we want to be on a path to get this done as quickly as possible. And sometimes it's easy, like it was with follows and usernames where we had a clear path. And sometimes it's hard for technical reasons, like with channels and direct messages, where it's taken a bit longer and the plan has taken a longer time. But our eventual goal is to move all of these primitives into the protocol so all clients have a level playing field.
Yeah, that's kind of very useful way to think about it. The first part of the main thing, the revealed preference being that people want users, that makes me think back to the old Albert Wenger, I don't know how you say his name, the Union Square's VC. He wrote an article about fat protocols, and there was lots of back and forth about it several years ago about can fat protocols survive, thin protocols might be better, so forth. The competition between the protocol and things that are built on the protocol. It sounds to me like one way to interpret what you're saying is Farcaster is going to be a fat protocol, but fat in the base technical primitive features, and also fat in a social sense of it's kind of where the baseline user acquisition happens. So more and more people flood into it, but you then don't do much with the users. You leave actually adding value to the user experience as much as possible to the layer on top, which is I think kind of interesting. And when I think about similar challenges at ActivityPub and at Proto, I think one of the things Farcaster, I think, can claim a greater success is the diversity of clients proves that your strategy is working somewhat better. Whereas I believe ActivityPub Mastodon pretty much dominates the entire sort of client space. And with Blue Sky, they've taken a different approach where it's not quite clear what counts as a client. They have custom feeds. So there's multiple ways to think about this problem. But I don't want to take up all the time. I want to leave time for other people to ask questions. We actually have an ActivityPub project in our cohort this year. If Evan or Tom is on, hopefully they'll have questions. But I'll close with one last question on my end, which is any advice to protocol entrepreneurs, as in how is it different from doing a regular startup, top 3 tips to people building protocol-based things?
Yeah. So I actually feel like I should ask you guys this question because you've been studying this all summer and talking to some of the smartest protocol people. But I will try to give you my best answer. I think that the term protocol entrepreneur is actually interesting because, at least in the world of software, most people that built early valuable protocols were not entrepreneurs in the sense that they did not make a lot of money off of it. So if you think of Web 1, Tim Berners-Lee, the team that brought the SMTP protocol, Linus Torvalds, they didn't actually make a lot of money off of the things that they built. And so I think that there are actually 2 branches to go around building protocols. I think there are still some protocols that can be built where there is not a lot of value capture. And so you can create something meaningful and powerful for the world, but you might not get rich off of it. And that just might be the nature of how that works. And there are going to be protocols where you can actually start companies and do things because of the nature of the problem and the nature of what you can do. And I think the first thing is to figure out what path you are on and where that is going to take you and what resources you need to be successful. The second challenge, I think, is we don't have a lot of successful case studies yet. If you look at Bitcoin, arguably one of the most successful protocols, I don't know that I would recommend Satoshi Nakamoto's path as the thing to go and follow. It just creates something and then disappear and wait for it to be successful. And if you kind of look at Vitalik, and the Ethereum Foundation that created the next iteration of that, their path was a little different. They actually raised a lot of money. They got a lot of resources. They built this massive thing. But again, not something that you can go to do today for regulatory reasons and for other reasons. And so the current incarnation of protocol entrepreneurs seems to be you are either tackling a problem that can be done individually without a lot of money and resources, and you can kind of go at it yourself, or you are tackling this massive scale problem where you will need tens or hundreds of people working in concert, and you have to go find a source of funding to go and do that. And I think figuring out this distinction in what kind of protocol and what resources you need to build is maybe the one piece of advice that I would have for anyone thinking of becoming a protocol entrepreneur.
Awesome. So with that, let's segue into the broader Q&A. So Josh, yeah. take it away.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Varun. Have a few questions here in the YouTube chat. First one is from Eric Larson, and his question is, what do you think about gated paid chats and channels in Farcaster?
Yeah, so one of the things, actually, just for folks who aren't on Farcaster yet, channels are kind of like a Reddit-like idea that we brought to Farcaster, which has historically looked like Twitter, where you can have these little sub-communities. You can create a channel, for example, for F1 racing or for the summer of protocols or any niche topic and bring people in and talk about it. And we're actually in the process of decentralizing and moving these from the sort of Warpcast type feature to the Farcaster type feature. One of the things that's actually, I think, super interesting is letting people, the owners of the channel and the space decide, hey, who gets to participate in here and why do they get to participate in here? And V1 of what we built was a very crude, you could charge some amount of currency for people to join your channel. So you could say, hey, you have to pay a small fee to be able to post in the channel. But we think a much more interesting model is where the host or the owner of the channel can actually decide what that criteria is. It could be you must be followed by me, or you must be followed by someone who follows me, or you bought my NFT, or I've added you to a list of interesting people. We actually think like a massive degree of flexibility is important. And so we have this like really cool new channels design. I'll actually tweet this out for folks who are interested right after this and cast it as well, where we actually allow you to import a bot where you can program a set of rules and say like, okay, these are the kind of posts that are allowed in my channel. And these bots are actually built by third-party developers. There's one called Automod, and you can program it to do whatever you like. So if you want a channel where only people who follow you can participate, or only people who own your NFT can participate, or people you've added to a list, or any rules you can think of, that's always going to be possible. And so you can create these micro communities within the macro Farcaster community.
Awesome, thank you. Now the next question is from Perks, and their question is, what do you believe are the reasons why Farcaster can win over other platforms like Blue Sky or Mastodon? If they were to add a feature like frames, do you think that would stifle the growth of Farcaster?
So it's a good question, and I think if Farcaster were to fail, it's going to be because of our own doing and because we didn't really focus on what users want. While Farcaster and ActivityPub and Blue Sky, all of these are decentralized protocols, we're going after very different use cases. Like the reason to be on Farcaster today, the way I would pitch it is if you want to see the most interesting stuff happening in crypto and you want to be closest to the people building on crypto, you want to be on Farcaster. That's not the reason you're joining Blue Sky. That's not the reason you're necessarily joining ActivityPub. And you might get a little bit of that on Twitter, but it's not the main job to be done on Twitter. And so I think the way Farcaster wins is if we can find one community where we become the most useful product, in the same way that Facebook was the place to be if you're a college student, Snapchat was the place to be if you're a high school student, and then we can slowly go outwards from there and grow with this industry to be useful. I don't think we really see ourselves in a direct sense of competing with Blue Sky. Like I don't think the average Farcaster user goes to Blue Sky and gets the same thing out of that experience, or vice versa today.
I think that makes sense. Next question is from Gramojo. Question is, the team has said that they would like to allow nodes to be deployed by regular people, quote unquote. But looking at the recent spec, it still requires a lot of money and resources to spin up a node. Any thoughts on how this becomes easier in the future?
Yeah. So for context for folks, Farcaster has like nodes in this network. We call them hubs, where you could just download a node and actually sync it, and within like an hour, you'll have full access to all of the data on the network. And the idea is there are many such nodes, the data is backed up everywhere, so no one person controls the network. Today, there are about 1,000, 1,200 nodes in the network replicated across the world that are all syncing data. Some run by teams building applications, some run by companies providing infrastructure services or access to the data, some run by users, and so on. The way we think about nodes and what is the job to be done for the nodes is have enough nodes replicated across geographies and across users so that no one node is in control. And that number is probably somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 nodes. I think if we're there, we have a strongly decentralized network, and we're in a very, very good place. And we've kind of hit that bar today. Second, I don't think nodes are going to be run by regular people in the long run, because social data is actually quite heavy in terms of today nodes take about 100 gigabytes of space. And we actually assume, and we plan for these nodes to grow up to a terabyte or even like tens of terabytes as the network gets larger and larger. And we think that nodes are going to be operated by people who are getting value out of having access to the data in the ecosystem. So people building applications, people building clients, people doing data analysis, people like Alchemy and other infrastructure providers who want to provide data to other users. These are, I think, the long-term people going to be running nodes. And I think in the broad sense, we'll have thousands of these and we'll reach a level of decentralization. I think our goals are a little different from something like Ethereum, which actually derives security properties from this decentralization, which we don't necessarily do. We actually rely on Ethereum for security. And so Ethereum actually has a much more aggressive goal of like, we want it to be run on any laptop in the world and that you can run it from a desktop. And ours is like, no, it's something like a beefy cloud computer that costs you maybe $1,000 a year. That's our benchmark for what we want this to be run on.
Thank you. Next question is from Panayotis. Their question is, are there cultural barriers or problems when building a social network like this in a global scale? For example, people creating a football channel and then unable to agree what actual sport this channel is for.
So Brightpan is an early user of Farcaster, and this was a running joke in the early days. When we were prototyping channels, we initially just had like a handful of channels that we would manually assign out. And my co-founder, Dan, made the very controversial decision at the time of assigning football to the American Football Channel, which didn't go down so well. And eventually it was renamed to the Soccer Channel. But this is actually one of the reasons we wanted decentralized channel ownership over time. And why we're working on this right now is ultimately like the community should make the decision on how this works, and there should be some allocation process for football versus soccer, and people should grab it and be able to use it for what they want to do it. It will not be a Dan assigned channel name structure in the future.
And somewhat related, a question from Winnie is asking, how do you deal with channel squatters? Do you see this concentration of power to an early individual a necessary trade-off? And is there any way that you might deal with abusive and negligent squatting in that way?
Yeah, this is a really good question about namespaces in general, and I think we also had the tension when figuring out like how do usernames on Farcaster work. Like if I grab Venkat before Venkat gets to it, like what's the right path? Is that okay? Can you buy it from me, etc. I think there are broadly speaking two camps on this. One is the like largely first come first serve model of like you can buy and trade names, and if you came and got it first, it's yours, and then you can sell it later and it's valuable. The other camp is names must be held by their rightful owner, which is a very subjective thing, but there is some moderated and sort of regulated space where things happen. And if you look at any common namespace, whether it's domain names or ENS names, they tend to fall like somewhere on the spectrum. Like no one is sort of at the like cartoonish ends of either spectrum. Like ENS launched but said like, hey, we're not going to do short names in this. We're going to do this slowly so everybody has a chance to buy it. Domain names still have rules around like who can claim names, et cetera, et cetera. The way we are thinking about channel names is we originally launched it in very much the extreme camp of, hey, we're going to assign it out and we're going to make sure they're correctly assigned because this is a very early feature and we're testing out how it works. And I think as we deploy it, we're going to graduate it into a, hey, the channels are on chain and once you own them, they're yours, and there's some process by which you can trade them and exchange them to other users. So sort of gradually move from one camp to the other. The actual mechanics of how is this going to work exactly, there's actually a good ongoing discussion that Dan's been driving on Farcaster about what that process looks like and the trade-offs, and we're going to finalize on that in the next week or so.
I'm going to chime in with a question. I don't know if Evan or Tom are in the audience somewhere, but since we have a project aiming to do end-to-end encryption in ActivityPub for direct messages, I wanted to ask specifically about that. It seems like direct messaging in a federated system is always like an insane challenge. Can you like explain why that is in general terms, not just blockchain world?
Yeah. So we actually have a lot of battle scars from this because we tried to build end-to-end encrypted messaging, and it ended up being something that was fairly challenging to the point where we realized, okay, we're going to have to get a team of 3 or for people who are thinking about nothing but this to actually get this done correctly. So why is it challenging, and what is the source of all of this pain? If you take the very, very simple, naive version of messaging, which is like one-to-one messaging between two counterparties, it's actually not terribly hard to do that very well. Getting the basic version of messaging, I think, is pretty easy. You can take something like Signal's double ratchet protocol. You have people do key exchange. There's a bunch of libraries and very tested ways you can do this. The problem is that most messaging apps have evolved to the point where there are 1,000 additional features that are now table stakes for people wanting to do anything in the ecosystem. These all significantly start increasing the complexity of what we do here. So as an example, group chats are really common. It's hard to imagine a direct messaging protocol without some notion of a group chat, but encryption in group chats is really, really hard. Effectively, the best method we've gotten so far is encrypt a message once for every person and once for every device that they own, which if you try to do it in a decentralized manner is just very, very, very difficult to have all of that data. So all of these features just create a lot of complexity. It's not an insurmountable challenge, but you do need a well-resourced team and a lot of work to get all this done, because all of this client-side magic of how to make all this work is fairly complicated. The second problem tends to become, how do messages go between apps? And if you look at anything like Signal or WhatsApp, they all have a central server, i.e. the Signal server or the WhatsApp server, that acts as the message broker, knowing where you are and handing messages back and forth and doing stuff in a reasonably safe and secure way. If you care about privacy and encryption and you have this decentralized world, it actually becomes really challenging because these other servers can now infer things about your IP address and where you're based on and how things happen. And so you start to lose some of these privacy guarantees unless you're very thoughtful about how you design that. So that's like another really hard problem space, is who is the server that takes my messages and hands it to someone else? And why do I trust that this is actually working correctly? And the final boss, and this is the hardest problem, is in a Signal world, I know that you're using Signal, I'm using Signal, and I trust that you're using the same software and I'm using the same software and encryption works. But in a truly decentralized world, you could be using, a client written by somebody who just decided to build one yesterday that has terrible encryption, and I could be using the super safe Signal thing and expecting everything works. And there's this okay, these messages are not private at all. There's no expectation of privacy. So you actually have to train the users on oh, there's this other security model of you care about what client that other person uses. And if that other person uses many clients, your security is only as good as their weakest client. And how do you actually teach people about that? That's actually just a user experience problem that you have to go figure out. So these are kind of the three reasons why it's hard. It's the user experience problem, the central server, and then just the difficulty of just all the additional features like group chats and so on.
Thanks. Looks like we have another.
Sorry. Yep, I was muted there. We are at a time. Do you have a couple extra minutes to answer?
Sure.
Varun, or do you need
one
to
or two questions?
Cool. This one is pretty interesting, I think, from Willie asking, beyond the initial cohort of crypto adjacent early adopters, how would you see Farcaster altering the cultural dynamics of social media?
So the why behind, why do we want to build Farcaster, the long-term vision, is social media, social networks in particular, are becoming the way in which people consume information. It's no longer newspapers, it's no longer television. It's people are getting their primary sources of information through things that they follow online. And we think it's very important for it to actually be decentralized so that no one person is in charge. Even if you like Elon Musk and are a fan of how Twitter is being run today, Elon Musk is not going to run Twitter forever, and a decentralized communication protocol is something that needs to live for a very long time. And you want to be certain that whoever is owning this in the future is aligned with your interests and your incentives. And the best way we found to achieve that with internet and the email has been decentralizing things. So that's the why behind Farcaster. Very specifically, though, the reason we've started with sort of crypto and crypto adjacent folks is that's an easy community to go after, that's underserved, that's someone we can build something for that's really valuable. The things that we've been thinking about are, how do we segue out of this? Our POV is there's still somewhere between 2x and 10x larger that we can grow just focusing on crypto, and that's going to be focus one. But over time, the bet that we are making is with channels, that channels and the ability to create spaces where people can talk about adjacent interests are going to naturally create conversations that people who are maybe not necessarily crypto adjacent will want to come and be a part of. Like there's a longevity channel on Farcaster where people talk about all kinds of supplements and proteins and other things, which is not really a crypto inherent topic, but it turns out to have a high density of people because a lot of folks in crypto are into that. And you can see that, you know, in a year or two, if that channel continues to grow, it actually becomes a draw for someone outside of crypto to come in and be a part of that, even if they have no adjacency to crypto. And so that's the bet that we're making, is that enough of these subcultures will form through features like channels that it will more easily expand to a wider audience as Farcaster gets bigger within crypto.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think that we can probably go ahead and wrap it up there. Thank you so much for spending some time with us and answering questions. It's been super informative, and yeah, thank you.
Yep. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Varun. And quick point for all the people in the program, we do have an SOP channel on Farcaster. So sign up for Farcaster if you haven't yet and start following the channel. We post a lot of fun memes there.
Great. I will see you all on Farcaster.